This is wrestling's greatest moments.
Hey now, wrestling fans, it's time for another episode of Wrestling's Greatest Moments. The Four Horsemen debuted in 1985, forever changing the way fans looked at factions. However, it was in 1986 when Tully Blanchard, Arn and Ole Anderson, and Ric Flair began a reign of terror unlike anything ever seen in Jim Crockett Promotions. Sit back as Wrestling's Greatest Moments looks at 1986, The Wrath of the Four Horsemen Part 1. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single video. As Arn Anderson famously said in interviews, what's causing all this? Who are the Four Horsemen and why should anyone care about them? Simply put, the heel quartet took factions to a new level. In his book, The Four Horsemen, A Timeline History, wrestling historian Dick Bourne explains what made the Horsemen different from other factions or stables. The four men who came together to form the original group, Ole and Arn Anderson, Ric Flair, and Tully Blanchard, were simply four wrestlers who had common goals, common lifestyles, and common enemies. The commonality was easy to explain. All four men liked to win and retain championship gold. They liked the luxurious lifestyle that being champions afforded them. They also had an alliance, which meant that anyone who crossed one horseman had to deal with all four. While Dusty Rhodes was a common enemy, the Horsemen's hit list would grow over time to include some of Jim Crockett Promotions' top babyfaces, including the Rock and Roll Express, Magnum TA, the Road Warriors, and Ronnie Garvin. The Four Horsemen came together in 1985 as wrestler Tully Blanchard began associating with the Andersons and Ric Flair. The Andersons and Flair were members of the legendary but entirely kayfabe wrestling family, the Andersons, aka the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. The Andersons had wreaked havoc in Georgia Championship Wrestling dating back to the 1960s when Lars and Gene Anderson teamed up, capturing championship gold. Later, Gene teamed with his other kayfabe brother, Ole Anderson, terrorizing Georgia Championship Wrestling and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling during the 1970s and early 80s. Ric Flair was introduced as the Andersons' cousin when he debuted in the Mid-Atlantic region, and sometimes teaming with, but just as often feuding with, his cousins. Although the lineup of the Andersons changed over time, there was always one constant: family. Check out our upcoming miniseries, The Evolution of the Four Horsemen, for more details on the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. Lars Anderson faded from the scene, and by the early 80s, Gene Anderson was all but retired. However, Ole introduced his cousin, or brother depending on what promoters decided the relationship was at the time, Arn Anderson, who soon proved he was up to the Anderson name and being double tough and ruthless. Interestingly, while the Andersons worked as heels, Ric Flair was often cheered in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, despite usually working as a heel in other NWA territories. That all changed after September 29, 1985. That night, Flair defeated the hated Russian heel Nikita Koloff in a steel cage match, only to be attacked afterward by Nikita and Ivan Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev. Thankfully for Flair, Dusty Rhodes came out for the save, only for Arn and Ole Anderson to show up and attack the American Dream. Now, fans had to wonder whether Flair would repay Dusty by helping him fight off the Andersons. Flair stopped when he reached the cage door. Was he going to help Dusty? As detailed in the book Wrestling's Greatest Moments, fans quickly discovered that was the furthest thing from Flair's mind. Instead, the Nature Boy locked the door, leaving Rhodes at the mercy of three of the most dangerous men in professional wrestling. Inside this locked cell, the three men began to pummel Dusty with hands and fists. Things worsened as the three heels targeted Dusty's ankle as a group of babyfaces fought their way into the cage. However, by the time they arrived, the damage was already done to the ankle of Stardust, one of Dusty's nicknames long before Cody Rhodes adopted the name in the WWE. Flair was now fully aligned with the Andersons, while Tully Blanchard continued associating with them as well. While the exact date is unknown, at some point the group was nicknamed the Four Horsemen, a reference to the destructive force in the Book of Revelation, as well as Notre Dame University's legendary football players. A rocky start for The Rock. Ole Anderson was often nicknamed The Rock long before Dwayne Johnson took the moniker, and he had a rough start in 1986. The year started off on the wrong foot for the Horsemen, or in the case of Ole Anderson, the wrong leg. On January 1st, Dusty Rhodes broke Ole's leg, gaining revenge for the Andersons and Ric Flair breaking his leg in a steel cage match after the American Dream had saved Flair from a post-match beatdown by the Russians Ivan Koloff, Nikita Koloff, and Crusher Khrushchev. Dusty's uncalled-for attack, at least that's how Tully Blanchard described the assault, occurred at the Omni in Atlanta after the Road Warriors and the Dream defeated Ric Flair and the Andersons by disqualification. Dusty jumped off the top rope not once but twice onto Ole's leg. Rhodes wasn't finished as he applied the figure 4 leg lock to Ole, snapping his leg. Ole was stretchered out, but not before the ring ropes had to be removed to gain access. On paper, things looked bad for the Four Horsemen. Not only had Ole been taken out of action, but Tully Blanchard's bodyguard, Baby Doll, parted ways with him after an incident where Blanchard slapped her. Fans tuning in to the January 4th episode of World Championship Wrestling knew 1986 was already off to a wild start. Tully Blanchard showed up with veteran heel manager James J. Dillon, who fans learned was now aligned with Blanchard. However, why had Blanchard and his former Perfect 10, Baby Doll, split on such bad terms? Announcer David Crockett played footage from a recent episode of Worldwide Wrestling where an angry Tully Blanchard confronted Baby Doll about her whereabouts over the Christmas holiday. Baby Doll explained herself, telling Blanchard she'd enjoyed a trip to Acapulco thanks to a ticket J.J. Dillon had given her on Tully's behalf. Tully knew nothing about it, and Baby Doll pleaded with Dillon to back her up, with Dillon saying she'd have to do better. Blanchard said something was rotten in Denmark and grew angry, with Baby Doll telling Dillon to clear the air. Finally, Blanchard slapped Baby Doll as announcer David Crockett tried to step in, only to be restrained by Dillon. Thankfully, Dusty Rhodes showed up, driving Blanchard off and warning him to never lay his hands on Baby Doll because she belongs to him now. As wrestling historian Dick Bourne writes in his book, The Four Horsemen: A Timeline History, fans reading between the lines saw what Dillon's game was. It's clear to fans that JJ set Baby Doll up to build distrust between her and Tully. Dillon maneuvered Baby Doll out of the picture and conveniently moved in, becoming associate director of Tully Blanchard Enterprises. In fact, JJ revealed he'd stopped representing his other clients in order to devote his full attention to Tully Blanchard Enterprises. While it would be months before he became the executive director of the Four Horsemen, Dillon had gotten his foot in the door, stirring up a hornet's nest. Wrestling fans soon discovered that the Four Horsemen weren't going to tolerate an attack on one of their members. J.J. Dillon revealed a diabolical plan designed to deal with Dusty Rhodes following his attack on Ole. Dillon boasted that he knew Rhodes better than anyone in Jim Crockett Promotions. Indeed, Dillon's battles with the Dream dated back to both men's time in championship wrestling from Florida years back. JJ announced the Horsemen were going to employ the domino theory, taking out Dusty's friends one by one until they eventually knocked off Dusty himself. Dillon said the first target was Jimmy Boogie Woogie Man Valiant, who few fans knew was a longtime and close friend to Rhodes. Tully said that he wouldn't just take out Dusty and his friends, he'd take the Dream's national championship, then bring Baby Doll back to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. Naturally, wrestling fans wanted to know what Dusty thought, and he showed up later with Baby Doll by his side, stating Baby Doll wasn't his valet or his manager, but his personal. Rhodes reminded everyone that he'd promised revenge on the Four Horsemen for breaking his ankle, and he vowed to start with the head of the family, Ole Anderson, with Arn being next. Baby Doll took a few shots at Tully, promising revenge for slapping her as she walked away with the new national heavyweight champion. Fans had heard from Tully Blanchard about the attack on the Horsemen's Ole Anderson, but what did Ole's kayfabe cousin Ric Flair and Ole's cousin Arn Anderson have to say? Slick Rick said he'd warned Tully about Baby Doll a year ago, but now that she was gone, he could speak the truth without worrying about Tully's feelings. Flair revealed he'd never liked Baby Doll and that at one point she'd even approached him about riding Space Mountain, only for a gracious Flair to turn her down. Arn Anderson blasted everyone involved with Dusty's attack on Ole, praising how Ole had helped raise him up. Anderson said Dusty used steel-toe boots in the ring, something that would lead to fines or suspensions if the Horsemen wore them. Arn and Flair said they'd spoken with their family members, promising Dusty would be back in the hospital within 90 days. Baby Doll showed up, pointing her finger at Arn and promising he was next. Arn told her to leave and that women were only good for two things, making dinner and making babies. Flair then demonstrated what would happen had he allowed Baby Doll on Space Mountain as he rolled around on the studio floor like he was experiencing a grand mal seizure. And what of handsome Jimmy, the Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant? He showed up late in the show to tell announcer Tony Schiavone it was no secret that he and Dusty Rhodes were tight. Valiant said he and Dusty were like outlaw country singers Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, and nothing further needed to be said about their friendship. Valiant called out J.J. Dillon and Tully Blanchard, saying he was right here waiting for them. 1985 had been about the Boogeyman staying alive, but 1986 was about getting his kicks, and he was ready to start with Tully Blanchard. Like the warning signs of the biblical apocalypse, the January 4th, 1986 episode of World Championship Wrestling was an omen of the terror and destruction to hit Jim Crockett Promotions that year. Join us next time as the Horsemen strike back. Do you remember the Four Horsemen's 1986 Reign of Terror? Share your thoughts in the comments section and let us know if there are any videos you'd like Wrestling's Greatest Moments to cover. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and spread the good news about Wrestling's Greatest Moments, the channel that celebrates the squared circle.